They called me barren, as though the word itself could strip me of my worth, as though my womb were the only measure of my existence. I learned to smile through their whispers, to curtsy through their cruelty. But on the night I heard a child crying in the darkness of Thornfield Manor, I understood that fate had been waiting for me to find something they could never take away. I was 26 years old when I stopped believing in the possibility of happiness. It was not a dramatic surrender, not a single moment of collapse, but rather a slow erosion, like stone worn smooth by centuries of rain. My name was Eleanor Ashford, though I had been Lady Thornfield for 3 years, and in all that time I had never once felt that the title belonged to me. My marriage to Sebastian Hale, the 6th Duke of Thornfield, had been arranged by my father when I was barely 23. I remember the day he told me, his voice careful and measured, as though he were discussing the sale of livestock rather than the future of his only daughter. The Ashford estate was failing, he explained. Our debts had grown insurmountable, and the Duke of Thornfield, recently inherited and in need of a wife of good breeding, had offered a sum generous enough to save us all. I did not cry when I learned of my fate. I had been raised to understand that daughters of declining families were currency, nothing more. We were traded for security, for alliances, for the preservation of names that meant everything to men and nothing to the women who carried them. I accepted my role with the quiet dignity my mother had taught me, and on a gray morning in April of 1844, I became the Duchess of Thornfield. Sebastian was not unkind to me in those early days. He was simply absent. I learned quickly that my husband was a man of silence, of closed doors and unanswered questions. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples and eyes the color of winter storms. When he looked at me, which was rare, I felt as though he were searching for something he knew he would never find. He treated me with the same distant courtesy he extended to the servants, and I understood without being told that I was not to expect more. Our wedding night was a brief and clinical affair. He came to my chambers with the expression of a man fulfilling an obligation, and when it was over, he left without a word. I lay alone in the enormous bed, staring at the canopy above me, and I told myself that this was simply how marriages worked among people of our station. Love was a fairy tale for children. Duty was the reality of women like me. The months passed, and my body refused to do what was expected of it. Each time my courses arrived, I felt the weight of failure pressing harder against my chest. Sebastian never spoke of it directly, but I saw the way his jaw tightened when his mother made her pointed remarks at dinner. I saw the way he avoided my eyes when the topic of heirs arose in conversation. And I saw, most painfully of all, the way he gradually stopped coming to my chambers altogether. By the end of our first year, the whispers had begun. The Duchess of Thornfield was barren. The word spread through London society like a disease, carried on the breath of women who smiled at me in ballrooms and destroyed me in drawing rooms. I became accustomed to the sidelong glances, the pitying looks that were not pity at all, but satisfaction. There is a particular cruelty that women of society reserve for those who fail to fulfill their purpose, and I received it in abundance. Sebastian's mother, the Dowager Duchess Philippa, was the architect of much of my misery. She was a woman of 60 years, with silver hair pulled back in a severe arrangement and eyes that missed nothing. She had never approved of me, had made that clear from the moment I arrived at Thornfield. I was not wealthy enough, not connected enough, not anything enough to deserve her son. And now, with my apparent inability to produce an heir, she had all the ammunition she needed. "You must try harder," she would tell me over breakfast, her voice dripping with false concern. "Perhaps if you ate less, perhaps if you prayed more, perhaps if you were not so cold in your demeanor, my son would find you more appealing." I absorbed her words like blows, learning to keep my face expressionless even as my heart shattered beneath my ribs. I had no defense against her accusations because I believed them myself. I was failing. I was broken. I was everything they said I was. The second year of my marriage was worse than the first. Sebastian began traveling frequently, attending to business matters that seemed to multiply with each passing month. He would be gone for weeks at a time, and when he returned, he barely acknowledged my presence. I moved through Thornfield Manor like a ghost, haunting rooms that would never feel like home. I remember standing at my window on countless mornings, watching the mist rise from the gardens below, wondering if this was all my life would ever be. The grounds of Thornfield were beautiful in their severity, all manicured hedges and ancient oak trees, but they felt more like a prison than a paradise. I was the lady of this house, and yet I owned nothing within it. Not the furniture, not the paintings, not even the clothes upon my back. Everything belonged to Sebastian, including me. There were moments when I caught him watching me across the dinner table, his expression unreadable. I would feel his gaze upon me like a physical weight, and when I lifted my eyes to meet his, he would look away as though caught in some shameful act. I did not understand him. I did not understand what he wanted from me, if he wanted anything at all. Perhaps he was simply waiting for me to disappear, to fade away like the morning mist and leave him free of the burden of a barren wife. The staff treated me with a careful deference that bordered on pity. Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, was the only one who showed me genuine kindness. She was a stout woman with graying hair and warm brown eyes, and she had been at Thornfield since Sebastian was a child. She would sometimes bring me tea in the afternoons, sitting with me in the library while I pretended to read. She never spoke of my situation directly, but her presence was a comfort I desperately needed. It was Mrs. Blackwood who first mentioned the West Wing to me. I had been at Thornfield for nearly 2 years and had never ventured beyond the central halls and the East Wing where my chambers were located. The West Wing, I had been told upon my arrival, was closed for renovations, but Mrs. Blackwood let slip one afternoon that there were no renovations, had never been any renovations. The West Wing had simply been sealed off since the death of Lady Margaret. "Who was Lady Margaret?" I asked, and I watched as Mrs. Blackwood's face went pale. She set down her teacup with trembling hands and told me I must never ask that question again. It was not her place to say, and it was not my place to know. Some secrets, she said, were buried for good reason. I did not press her further, but the name lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. Lady Margaret. I had never heard Sebastian speak of anyone by that name. I had never seen any portrait or memorial that bore it, and yet the mention of it had turned the unflappable Mrs. Blackwood into a frightened woman. The 3rd year brought with it a hardening of my spirit. I stopped hoping for Sebastian's affection. I stopped dreaming of the children I would never have. I built walls around my heart so thick that even the dowager's cruelty could no longer penetrate them. I became what they had always accused me of being, cold, distant, empty. But I was not empty. Beneath the frozen surface, something still burned. I spent my days in the library, reading everything I could find: philosophy, history, poetry, novels that transported me to worlds where women could be more than vessels for heirs. I walked the grounds of Thornfield in all weather, memorizing every path and garden, learning the names of every flower and tree as though they were friends who might listen to my silent sorrows. I learned the rhythms of the household, the secrets the servants thought they were hiding. I became an observer of my own life, watching from a distance as the years slipped away. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I would allow myself to weep. I would bury my face in my pillow and release the grief I carried every waking moment. I wept for the children I would never hold, for the husband who would never love me, for the girl I had been before this marriage had hollowed me out. But when morning came, I would wash my face and dress myself in the armor of indifference that had become my only protection. It was on a night in late October, 3 years and 6 months after my wedding, that everything changed. A storm had descended upon Thornfield with a ferocity I had never witnessed. The wind howled against the windows like a living thing, and rain lashed the glass in sheets so thick I could not see the grounds below. Thunder rolled across the sky in great crashing waves, and lightning split the darkness with blinding frequency. The entire manor seemed to tremble beneath the assault, and I could hear the ancient timbers groaning in protest. I had retired early to my chambers, but sleep would not come. The thunder was too close, too violent, and every flash of lightning illuminated my room in stark white light that burned itself into my vision. I lay in bed for hours, listening to the tempest rage, feeling small and insignificant against the power of nature. I rose from my bed and lit a candle, thinking perhaps I would go to the library and read until the storm passed. The flame danced wildly as I carried it, casting strange shadows across the walls of my chamber. I pulled my dressing gown tighter around my shoulders and stepped into the corridor. But as I opened my door and stepped into the corridor, the flame flickered wildly in a draft I had never noticed before. I turned toward the east staircase, my usual route, but something made me pause. There was a sound beneath the thunder, faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably real. It was a cry, high and thin, like the mewling of a kitten. I stood frozen in the darkness, my candle casting dancing shadows on the walls, and I listened. The sound came again, and this time I was certain of what I heard. It was not an animal. It was a child, a baby, crying somewhere in the depths of Thornfield Manor. I told myself it was impossible. There were no children at Thornfield. There had never been any children. I was the Barren Duchess, the failed wife, and the house reflected my emptiness. And yet the crying continued, rising and falling with the rhythm of the storm, pulling at something deep within me that I thought had died long ago. I moved without conscious thought, following the sound through corridors I barely recognized. The candle trembled in my hand, its light barely enough to show me the way. I passed the grand staircase, past the portrait gallery with its rows of stern-faced ancestors, past the music room where I sometimes played the pianoforte to fill the silence. And then I stood before the entrance to the west wing. The door was massive and ancient, bound in iron that had rusted with age. A heavy lock secured it, and I knew without trying that I did not possess the key. I had walked past this door 100 times without thought, accepting its closure as simply another boundary of my diminished world. But now I pressed my ear against the cold wood, and I heard it clearly. A baby crying, somewhere beyond this barrier. A child, alone and frightened in the storm. I do not know what possessed me in that moment. Perhaps it was the years of emptiness, the desperate longing that had never truly faded despite my efforts to destroy it. Perhaps it was simply the instinct that lives in every woman, the primal need to comfort a crying child. Whatever the reason, I set down my candle and grasped the iron handle with both hands. The door did not move. I pulled harder, throwing my weight against it, but the lock held firm. I was about to turn away, to convince myself that I had imagined the sound, when I noticed something that made my heart stop. The key was in the lock. Someone had left it there, perhaps by accident, perhaps by design. It gleamed dully in the candlelight, waiting for a hand brave enough to turn it. I reached for the key before I could talk myself out of it. The metal was ice cold against my fingers, and it turned with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire house. The lock clicked open, and the door swung inward on hinges that had not moved in years. The west wing stretched before me, a corridor of shadows and dust. The air smelled of neglect, of rooms that had been sealed away from light and life. My candle barely penetrated the darkness, showing me only glimpses of covered furniture and faded wallpaper. But the crying was louder now, clearer. It came from somewhere ahead, from a room at the end of the corridor, and I moved toward it as though pulled by an invisible thread. I passed door after door, each one closed tight against whatever secrets it held. The storm raged outside, rattling the windows in their frames. But I no longer heard the thunder. There was only the crying, only the desperate need to find its source. The final door stood slightly ajar. Warm light spilled through the gap, and with it came the unmistakable sound of a woman's voice. soft and soothing, trying to calm the frightened child. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, and what I saw there would change everything I thought I knew about my husband, my marriage, and my own heart. A fire burned low in the grate, casting the room in amber light. The walls were covered in pale blue silk, faded but still beautiful, and delicate curtains framed the rain-streaked windows. A rocking chair sat near the window, its cushions worn from years of use. The room smelled of lavender and milk, of warmth and care, of everything that had been absent from my own life for so long. An elderly woman I had never seen before stood beside a cradle, her back to me, murmuring words I could not understand. Her hair was white as snow, pulled back in a simple braid, and her shoulders were stooped with age. She wore the plain dress of a servant, but there was something in her bearing that spoke of authority, of purpose. And in that cradle, wrapped in white linen edged with delicate lace, lay a baby. A tiny, perfect living child with a tuft of dark hair and cheeks flushed pink from crying. The woman turned at the sound of my entrance, and I saw fear flood her weathered face. She opened her mouth to speak, to scream perhaps, but I held up my hand to silence her. "Who is this child?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "And why is it hidden in the darkness of my husband's house?" The old woman's face held a terror so profound that I knew in that instant I had stumbled upon something that was never meant to be found. She clutched the edge of the cradle as though it were the only thing keeping her upright, and her lips moved in silent prayer as she stared at me across the dimly lit room. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked with age and fear. "Please, my lady, you must not be here. You must go back. Pretend you saw nothing." But I could not pretend. I could not unsee what stood before me, could not unhear the soft whimpers of the child who had finally quieted in its cradle. I took a step closer, then another, drawn by a force stronger than reason or propriety. "Whose child is this?" I asked again, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, steady when everything inside me trembled. The woman shook her head, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I cannot say, my lady. I am sworn to silence. His Grace would never forgive me. His Grace, Sebastian, my husband, who had kept this secret locked away in the darkness while I wandered his house like a ghost, believing myself alone in my sorrow." I reached the cradle and looked down at the child within. The baby had stopped crying and now gazed up at me with wide, unfocused eyes that seemed to search for something in my face. Dark hair, just a whisper of it, covered a perfectly round head. Tiny fingers curled against the white linen, grasping at nothing. I had never seen anything so beautiful, so miraculous, so utterly heartbreaking. "How old?" I asked, unable to tear my eyes away. 4 months, the woman answered reluctantly. "Born in June, during the first roses." I reached down without thinking, my fingers brushing against the baby's cheek. The skin was impossibly soft, warm with life, and the child turned toward my touch with an instinct as old as humanity itself. Something cracked open inside my chest, something I had thought long dead, and I felt tears spilling down my face before I even knew I was crying. The woman moved toward me then, her fear momentarily overcome by something like compassion. She placed a gentle hand on my arm and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Her name is Rose," she said. Lady Margaret named her before she passed. Rose, for the flowers that were blooming when she came into the world. Lady Margaret, the name Mrs. Blackwood had refused to speak, the name that had turned her pale with fear. I looked up at the old woman, my questions written plainly on my tear-streaked face. "She was His Grace's sister," the woman continued, and I could see that she had resigned herself to telling me what she knew. Younger than him by 5 years. The most beautiful girl in all of England, they said. Hair like spun gold, and a laugh that could light up the darkest room. "What happened to her?" I asked. though I already knew part of the answer. The cradle, the hidden room, the desperate secrecy. This was a story of shame and scandal, the kind that destroyed families and buried women in unmarked graves. The woman led me to the rocking chair by the window and urged me to sit. She settled herself on a small stool nearby, her old bones creaking with the movement, and she began to speak in the hushed tones of one sharing sacred confidences. Lady Margaret fell in love, she told me. That was her great sin. She fell in love with a man who could never be hers, a man of no title and no fortune, a painter who had been commissioned to capture her portrait. They met in secret for months, and by the time anyone discovered the truth, it was too late. She was with child. I listened in silence, my hand still resting on the edge of the cradle, feeling the gentle rhythm of Rose's breathing beneath my fingertips. The Dowager Duchess wanted to send her away, the woman continued, to a convent in France where she could have the child in secret and then return as though nothing had happened. But Lady Margaret refused. She loved the painter, you see. She believed he would come for her, that they would find a way to be together. And did he? I asked. Did he come for her? The woman's face hardened with an old anger that had not faded with time. He was found dead in his lodgings 3 days after the Duchess learned of the affair. They said it was an accident, a fall down the stairs. But there were those who whispered otherwise. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm still raging outside. The Dowager Duchess, that cold and calculating woman who had made my life a misery for 3 years, was capable of far more than cruel words. The realization settled over me like a shroud. Lady Margaret never recovered from his death, the woman went on. She refused to eat, refused to leave her chambers. His Grace moved her here, to the West Wing, where she could hide from the world and from her mother. He hired me to care for her, and I stayed by her side through all those dark months. The woman paused, her eyes distant with memory, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with grief. She was too weak by the time the baby came. The birth took everything she had left. She held little Rose for only an hour before she slipped away. Her last words were a plea to her brother, begging him to protect her daughter from the cruelty of the world. I sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile this story with everything I thought I knew about my husband. Sebastian, the cold and distant Duke, who had never shown me a moment of warmth, had hidden his sister away from scandal, had hired this woman to care for her, had kept her child safe in secret for 4 months. He had done all of this while I lived under his roof, believing him to be incapable of love. "Does anyone else know?" I asked finally. The woman shook her head. "Only his Grace and myself. And now you, my lady." I looked back at the cradle, at the innocent child sleeping peacefully, despite the storm and the secrets that surrounded her. Rose. A flower born from tragedy, hidden in the darkness, waiting for the light. "I cannot leave her here," I said, and the words surprised me even as I spoke them. "I cannot pretend I do not know she exists." The woman's face crumpled with fresh tears. "Please, my lady, if his Grace learns that I told you, he will send me away. And then, who will care for the child?" I rose from the chair and faced her squarely, something new taking shape inside me, something that felt like purpose for the first time in years. "I will care for her," I said, "and I will speak to my husband, myself. You have done nothing wrong. You have loved this child when no one else could. I will not let you be punished for that." The woman stared at me as though I had spoken in a foreign tongue. In her world, duchesses did not make promises to servants, did not concern themselves with the fates of illegitimate children, did not challenge the edicts of dukes. But I was not the duchess she expected. I was not the duchess I had been when I walked through that door. I stayed in that room until the storm began to fade, sitting beside the cradle, while the old woman, whose name I learned was Agnes, told me everything she remembered about Lady Margaret. She spoke of a young woman full of life and laughter, of a girl who had dreamed of love and found it in the most forbidden of places. She spoke of the months of hiding, of the dowager's rage and Sebastian's quiet defiance, of the night Rose was born and the morning Margaret died. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows, I felt as though I had lived another lifetime. I understood now why Sebastian was the way he was, why he had built such walls around his heart. He had lost his sister to love, had watched her waste away from grief, had been powerless to save her from either her own choices or their mother's cruelty. And now he carried the weight of her child's existence, protecting Rose from a world that would destroy her if it knew the truth. I left the West Wing as the household began to stir, slipping back through the corridors like a thief returning from a heist. My candle had long since burned out, but I no longer needed its light. I knew the path now, every door and every turning, and I knew that I would walk it again. When I reached my chambers, I found that I could not sleep. I sat by the window and watched the sun rise over the rain-soaked gardens, painting the world in shades of gold and rose. The storm had passed, leaving behind a freshness in the air that felt like renewal, like possibility. I thought of all the nights I had lain in this room, believing myself worthless because I could not give my husband an heir. I thought of all the cruel words I had absorbed, all the pitying glances I had endured, all the ways I had diminished myself to fit the small box the world had built for me. And I thought of Rose, that perfect child sleeping in her hidden cradle, waiting for someone to claim her as worthy of love. The world had decided that I was barren, that my body had failed in its most essential purpose. But perhaps there was more than one way to become a mother. Perhaps the child who needed me had been here all along, just waiting for me to find her. I did not see Sebastian that day, nor the day after. He had departed for London before the storm, Agnes told me, and was not expected to return for another week. I used the time to visit the West Wing every night, slipping through the corridors after the household had gone to sleep, spending hours with Rose and Agnes in that secret room. The baby began to recognize me, or so I chose to believe. Her eyes would follow my movements, and her little face would brighten when I leaned over her cradle. I learned to hold her properly, to support her head and rock her gently until she fell asleep in my arms. I learned the songs Agnes sang to soothe her, old lullabies in a dialect I did not recognize, and I added my own voice to the melody. It was during one of these visits, 5 days after my discovery, that Agnes told me something that changed everything once more. "His Grace comes here too," she said quietly, watching me as I cradled Rose against my chest. "Every night when he is home. He sits in that very chair where you are sitting now, and he holds her just as you are holding her. He does not speak much, but I see the way he looks at her. She is all he has left of Lady Margaret. I tried to imagine it, my cold and distant husband sitting in this room in the darkness, holding his sister's child with the tenderness he had never shown me. It seemed impossible, and yet Agnes had no reason to lie. He blames himself," Agnes continued, "for not protecting Lady Margaret better, for not stopping their mother before it was too late. He carries that guilt like chains around his heart." I looked down at Rose, at her peaceful face and her tiny fingers curled around a lock of my hair, and I felt something shift in my understanding of the man I had married. He was not cold because he could not feel. He was cold because he felt too much and had no one with whom he could share the burden. When Sebastian returned to Thornfield on the 7th day, I was ready. I had spent the week preparing what I would say, rehearsing the words in my mind until they felt natural. I knew that what I was about to do would change everything between us, for better or for worse. I knew that I was risking whatever fragile peace we had built over 3 years of careful distance. But I also knew that I could not go back to being the woman I had been before that stormy night. I had found something in that hidden room, something more valuable than any heir or any title. I had found a purpose, and I would not let it go without a fight. I waited until evening, when Sebastian had retired to his study, as was his habit. I stood outside the door for a long moment, gathering my courage, and then I knocked. His voice called for me to enter, and I pushed open the door to find him seated behind his massive oak desk, papers spread before him in the candlelight. He looked up at my entrance, and I saw surprise flicker across his features before he masked it with his usual composure. "Eleanor," he said, and it was the first time in months he had spoken my name. "Is something the matter?" I closed the door behind me and crossed the room to stand before his desk. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it, but my voice remained steady when I spoke. "I know about Rose," I said. "I know about Lady Margaret. I know everything." The color drained from his face. He rose slowly from his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. For a long moment, he simply stared at me, and in his eyes I saw fear and anger and something that might have been desperation. "Who told you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It does not matter who told me," I replied. "What matters is that I know. And I am not here to judge you, Sebastian. I am here to help you." He laughed then, a harsh and bitter sound that held no humor. "Help me? You cannot help me, Eleanor. No one can help me. That child is a scandal waiting to destroy us all. If anyone learns of her existence, everything I have worked to protect will crumble to dust." I stepped closer, refusing to be intimidated by his anger. "She is not a scandal," I said firmly. "She is a child, an innocent child who did not choose her circumstances, and she deserves more than a life hidden in darkness." Sebastian turned away from me, moving to the window to stare out at the night. His shoulders were rigid with tension, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with exhaustion. "You do not understand," he said. "My mother will never accept her. Society will never accept her. If the truth comes out, Rose will be forever marked as a bastard, as the product of shame and disgrace. I am trying to protect her from that fate, by keeping her locked away like a secret, by denying her the chance to know love and light and family." I moved to stand beside him, close enough to see my own reflection in the darkened glass. "That is not protection, Sebastian. That is imprisonment." He was quiet for a long time, and when he finally turned to face me, I saw something I had never seen before in his eyes: vulnerability, fear, hope. "What would you have me do?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the words. I took a breath and spoke the words I had been rehearsing for 7 days. "Let me be her mother," I said. "Let me raise her as my own, as the daughter I was told I could never have. We can tell the world whatever story you wish, that she is a distant relative, an orphaned cousin, anything that will explain her presence. But let her live in the light, Sebastian. Let her know that she is wanted and loved." He stared at me as though seeing me for the first time, as though all the years of our cold and distant marriage had fallen away to reveal someone he did not recognize. "You would do that?" he asked. "You would take on the burden of raising another woman's child, knowing what it would mean for your own reputation?" I reached out and took his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin against my palm, the first time we had touched in longer than I could remember. "She is not a burden," I said. "She is a gift, and I would be honored to be her mother." The silence that followed my words stretched between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. Sebastian stood frozen, my hand still clasped in his, and I could see the war being waged behind his eyes. 3 years of distance and duty had built walls so high that even this moment of connection seemed impossible to sustain. Then, slowly, his fingers tightened around mine. "You truly mean this," he said. And it was not quite a question, but not quite a statement either. It was something in between, a man testing the ground beneath his feet to see if it would hold. "I have never meant anything more," I replied. He released my hand and turned away, pacing the length of his study with the restless energy of a caged animal. I watched him move through the candlelight. This man I had lived beside for 3 years without ever truly seeing. There was tension in every line of his body, in the set of his jaw and the clench of his fists, but there was something else too, something that looked almost like hope. "My mother will never accept it," he said finally, stopping before the fireplace to stare into the dying flames. "She hated Margaret for what she did, for the shame she brought upon our family. When Margaret died, my mother said it was a mercy that at least the scandal had been contained. If she learns that Margaret's child still lives, if she discovers that I have been hiding Rose all these months, she will stop at nothing to destroy us." I rose from where I had been standing and moved to join him by the fire. The warmth of it touched my face, but it could not chase away the chill his words had settled in my bones. "Then we must be smarter than she is," I said. "We must create a story so convincing that even she cannot challenge it without risking her own reputation." Sebastian looked at me with something like wonder, as though he were seeing me for the first time. In all our years of marriage, I had never spoken to him like this, had never offered anything beyond quiet compliance and careful distance. But I was no longer the woman who had walked into this house as a silent sacrifice. I was someone new, someone forged in the fire of that stormy night and the child I had found in its aftermath. "What story would you suggest?" he asked. I had been thinking about this for days, turning the possibilities over in my mind like stones in a stream, examining each one for flaws and weaknesses. "We could say that Rose is the daughter of my cousin," I began. "A distant relative who died in childbirth, leaving no other family to care for the child. We took her in out of duty and compassion, as any Christian family would do. No one would question such an act of charity, and no one would think to connect her to Margaret." Sebastian considered this, his brow furrowed in thought. "And the timing. Rose is 4 months old. People will wonder why they have not heard of this cousin before, why there was no mourning period, no announcement." I smiled, a small and bitter expression that held no joy. "No one has been paying attention to me, Sebastian. The Barren Duchess, the failed wife. I could have a dozen cousins die, and no one would notice or care. We simply say that I kept the news private, that I was too grief-stricken to speak of it until now." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "You have thought about this," he said, "truly thought about it." "I have thought of nothing else," I admitted. "From the moment I saw her in that cradle, I knew that I would do whatever was necessary to give her a life in the light." "She is innocent, Sebastian. She did not ask to be born in secret, to be hidden away like something shameful. She deserves the chance to grow and thrive, to be loved openly, to know that she belongs somewhere." Sebastian reached out and took my hand again, and this time there was intention in the gesture, a deliberate crossing of the distance we had maintained for so long. "I do not deserve your help," he said quietly. "I have been a poor husband to you, Eleanor. I have given you nothing but coldness and neglect. I do not understand why you would do this for me, for Rose, after all I have failed to give you." I looked into his eyes, those storm-gray depths that had always seemed so impenetrable, and I saw the truth hidden beneath the surface. He was not cold. He was afraid. Afraid of love, afraid of loss, afraid of the pain that came from caring too deeply in a world that punished such weakness. "You have carried this burden alone for too long," I said. "Let me share it with you. Not because you deserve it or do not deserve it, but because it is the right thing to do, and because I want to." The days that followed were a careful dance of planning and preparation. Sebastian and I met each evening in his study, speaking in hushed tones about the details of our deception. We crafted the story of my fictional cousin, a young woman named Catherine who had married a naval officer and followed him to the coast, where she had died bringing Rose into the world. The officer had perished at sea months earlier, leaving the child with no family but me. It was a simple story, unremarkable in its tragedy, and that was precisely what made it believable. The world was full of orphaned children, of women who died in childbirth and men who died at sea. No one would think twice about another such tale, especially when it came from the lips of a duchess known for her quiet reserve and private grief. We decided to bring Rose into the main house gradually, first as a temporary arrangement, and then as a permanent addition to our household. Agnes would remain as her nurse, her loyalty to Margaret's memory ensuring her silence. The other servants would be told only what they needed to know, and their discretion would be ensured by generous wages and the threat of dismissal. The Dowager Duchess presented the greatest challenge. She lived in the dower house on the far edge of the estate, a comfortable distance that I had always considered a blessing. But she visited Thornfield regularly, sweeping through its halls like a queen inspecting her domain, and nothing escaped her notice. We will tell her last, Sebastian decided. Once Rose is established in the household, once the servants have accepted her presence, we will present my mother with a fait accompli. She may rage and protest, but she will not risk the scandal of contradicting our story in public. I was not so certain. I had seen the cruelty the Dowager was capable of, had felt its sting on my own skin for 3 long years. But I kept my doubts to myself, focusing instead on the joy of the days ahead. Rose was brought to the main house on a Tuesday morning in early November. I had prepared a nursery in the room adjacent to my own chambers, filling it with everything a child could need. A new cradle, carved from pale oak and draped in white linen. A rocking chair where Agnes could sit and sing her lullabies. Shelves lined with picture books and soft toys that I had ordered from London. It was a room made for love, and when Agnes carried Rose through its door for the first time, I felt my heart swell with an emotion I had thought forever beyond my reach. The servants accepted the story without question. Mrs. Blackwood, who had always shown me kindness, seemed genuinely pleased by the addition to the household. She had known Margaret, had loved her in her own quiet way, and though she never spoke of her suspicions, I saw understanding in her eyes when she looked at Rose. The child herself seemed to thrive in her new surroundings. She smiled more often now, great toothless grins that lit up her entire face. She reached for me whenever I entered the nursery, her small arms stretching toward me with an eagerness that brought tears to my eyes. I had never known such pure and unconditional love, had never imagined that such a thing could exist. Sebastian visited the nursery each evening after dinner, a ritual he had maintained even when Rose was hidden in the West Wing. But now he came openly, walking through the main halls without the secrecy that had marked his earlier visits. I would often find him there when I came to say goodnight to Rose, sitting in the rocking chair with the baby cradled in his arms, murmuring softly to her in words I could not quite hear. He looked different in those moments. The tension that habitually lined his face would fade, replaced by a tenderness that transformed his features entirely. He would look up when I entered, and something would pass between us, a recognition of the strange and wonderful partnership we had forged from the ruins of our failed marriage. We began to speak more freely during those evening visits. At first, our conversations centered on Rose, on her feeding schedule and her sleeping habits, on the tiny developments that marked her growth from one day to the next. But gradually, we ventured into other territories. He told me about Margaret, about the sister he had loved and failed to protect. He spoke of their childhood, of the games they had played in the gardens of Thornfield, of the secrets they had shared when they were young and the world still seemed full of possibility. He told me about the painter, about the man Margaret had loved, and about the night he had received word of the artist's death. I knew then that my mother had ordered it, he said one evening, his voice heavy with old grief. I could not prove it, could never prove it, but I knew. And I hated her for it. I still hate her for it. I listened without judgment, offering only the comfort of my presence and my silence. I understood now why he had built such walls around himself, why he had retreated into coldness and distance. He had been trapped between duty and love, between the mother who demanded his loyalty and the sister who needed his protection. In the end, he had chosen duty, and it had cost him everything. "Did Margaret know?" I asked gently. "About what your mother had done?" He nodded, his jaw tight with remembered pain. She knew. That was why she stopped eating, stopped fighting. She had nothing left to live for. I tried to tell her that she still had the baby, that Rose would need her, but she was already too far gone. The grief had consumed her entirely. I reached across the space between us and took his hand, as I had done that first night in his study. He did not pull away. "You could not have saved her," I said. "You did everything you could." "Did I?" He looked at me with eyes full of doubt. "Sometimes I think I should have taken her away, should have defied my mother openly and let the scandal fall where it may. Margaret might still be alive if I had been braver, or you might both have been destroyed," I replied. "Your mother is a powerful woman, Sebastian. She would have found a way to punish you, to take everything you have. You made the choice you thought was right, and you cannot torture yourself forever for a decision made in impossible circumstances." He was quiet for a long time, his thumb tracing absent patterns on the back of my hand. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You are not what I expected, Eleanor." I smiled, though there was sadness in it. "I know. I was not what anyone expected, including myself." The dowager arrived at Thornfield 3 weeks after Rose had been installed in the nursery. She came without warning, as was her habit, her carriage pulling up to the main entrance on a gray afternoon when the first snow of winter was just beginning to fall. I was in the drawing room when I heard the commotion in the entrance hall, the servant scurrying to receive her, her imperious voice demanding to know where her son could be found. My heart seized in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm. This was the moment we had been preparing for. This was the battle we had known was coming. Sebastian appeared at my side moments later, his face set in the mask of cold authority he wore like armor. He took my arm and led me toward the entrance hall, where the dowager stood shaking snow from her cloak, her sharp eyes already scanning the house for signs of change. "Mother," Sebastian said, his voice carefully neutral, "we were not expecting you." The dowager's gaze fixed on him with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. "Clearly not," she replied. "Otherwise, you might have informed me of the addition to your household before I heard of it from Lady Pemberton at tea." I felt Sebastian stiffen beside me, but his voice remained steady. "I intended to write to you," he said. "The situation arose rather suddenly. So, I gather." The dowager turned her attention to me, and I felt the full weight of her scrutiny pressing down on my shoulders. A cousin's child, I'm told. How convenient that this cousin, never mentioned during 3 years of marriage, should suddenly appear with an orphan in need of a home. "My cousin Catherine was not close to me in recent years," I said, keeping my voice level despite the pounding of my heart. "Her husband's posting kept them distant, and we corresponded only rarely. When I received word of her death, I felt it was my duty to take in her child. I hope you do not disapprove of our Christian charity, Your Grace." The dowager's eyes narrowed, but she could find no fault in my words or my tone. I had delivered them perfectly, with just the right mixture of humility and quiet dignity. For a moment, something flickered in her expression, something that might have been suspicion or might have been grudging respect. "I wish to see the child," she announced. Sebastian stepped forward, placing himself between his mother and the stairs that led to the nursery. "She is sleeping," he said. "Perhaps tomorrow, when she is awake and presentable." The dowager studied her son for a long moment, and I saw understanding dawn in her cold blue eyes. She knew. Perhaps not the specifics, not the full truth of Rose's parentage, but she knew that something was being hidden from her, and that knowledge made her dangerous. "Very well," she said at last. "Tomorrow, then. I will be staying in the dower house for the remainder of the week. I trust that will give us ample time to become acquainted with this new addition to the family." She swept out of the entrance hall without another word, leaving behind a chill that had nothing to do with the falling snow. Sebastian and I stood in silence, listening to the sound of her carriage departing, and I knew that the real battle had only just begun. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in my bed, listening to the wind howl against the windows, thinking of the dowager's cold eyes and the suspicion I had seen lurking within them. She was a woman who had destroyed her own daughter's lover without hesitation, who had driven Margaret to her death through cruelty and judgment. What would she do to Rose if she discovered the truth? I rose from my bed and walked to the nursery, needing to see the child, to assure myself that she was safe. Agnes was dozing in the rocking chair, but she stirred when I entered. "Is something wrong, my lady?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "No," I whispered. "I just needed to see her." I stood over the cradle and watched Rose sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. She was so small, so vulnerable, so utterly dependent on the protection of those who loved her, and I realized in that moment that I would do anything to keep her safe, anything at all. Sebastian found me there an hour later, still standing vigil over his sister's child. He said nothing, simply moved to stand beside me, his shoulder brushing against mine in the darkness. We remained there together until dawn began to lighten the sky, two people bound by secrets and promises, watching over the innocent life that had brought them together at last. The morning arrived too quickly, bringing with it the weight of what was to come. I dressed with particular care, choosing a gown of deep burgundy that had always made me feel stronger than I was. Agnes prepared Rose in her finest white dress, the one trimmed with delicate lace that had belonged to Margaret as an infant. If we were to face the dowager's judgment, we would do so with dignity. Sebastian met me outside the nursery, his face drawn but resolute. He had not slept either. I could see it in the shadows beneath his eyes. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, two soldiers preparing for a battle neither of us had chosen. "Are you ready?" he asked. I lifted my chin and squared my shoulders. "I have been ready since the night I found her." The dowager arrived precisely at 10, sweeping into the drawing room where we waited with Rose cradled in my arms. She wore black, as she always did, the color of perpetual mourning that she wielded like a weapon. Her eyes went immediately to the child, and I felt my grip tighten instinctively. "So," she said, approaching with measured steps, "this is the orphan." "Her name is Rose," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Rose Catherine Ashford Hale." The dowager stopped an arm's length away, her gaze fixed on the baby's face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Rose, oblivious to the tension surrounding her, reached out one small hand toward the unfamiliar figure. "She has dark hair," the dowager observed. "Your cousin was fair." "Was she not?" "I seem to recall you mentioning that in one of your letters. I had never written any such thing, had never mentioned Catherine in any letter because Catherine did not exist. The dowager was testing me, probing for weaknesses in our carefully constructed story." "Catherine's husband was dark," I said smoothly. "Rose takes after her father, God rest his soul." The dowager's lips thinned into a line that might have been a smile, or might have been something far more dangerous. "How fortunate that you remember so many details about a cousin you claim to know so poorly." Sebastian stepped forward, positioning himself at my side in a show of unity that was not lost on his mother. "The child is ours now, Mother," he said firmly. "Whatever questions you may have about her origins are irrelevant. Eleanor and I have taken her into our home and our hearts. She is a Hale, and she will be raised as such." The dowager turned her attention to her son, and something shifted in her expression. For a moment, the mask of cold control slipped, revealing a flash of something that looked almost like grief. "You think I do not know," she said quietly. "You think I am blind and foolish, Sebastian. But I knew from the moment Lady Pemberton spoke of this child, the timing, the secrecy, the way you have guarded this house like a fortress for months. I know whose child this is." The room fell silent. I felt the blood drain from my face, felt the floor seem to tilt beneath my feet. Beside me, Sebastian had gone rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Mother," he began, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Do not insult me with more lies," she snapped. "I gave birth to Margaret. I raised her, clothed her, taught her everything she knew. Do you truly believe I would not recognize her child?" She moved closer, and despite my fear, I did not step back. I held Rose tighter against my chest and met the dowager's gaze with all the courage I could summon. "If you know the truth," I said, "then you know that this child is innocent. She did not choose her parents, did not choose the circumstances of her birth. She is guilty of nothing but existing, and I will not let you punish her for that." The dowager stared at me as though seeing me for the first time. For 3 years, she had dismissed me as insignificant, as a barren disappointment unworthy of her attention. But now something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been surprise or grudging acknowledgement. "You have more spirit than I credited you with," she said finally. "But spirit will not protect this child from the world. If the truth comes out, she will be destroyed. Society will not forgive the circumstances of her birth, no matter how innocent she may be." "Then help us protect her," Sebastian said, and there was a plea in his voice that I had never heard before. "Help us give her a chance at a life free from scandal. You are the only one who could expose us. Mother, if you keep our secret, no one else ever needs to know." The dowager was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving between her son, the child, and me. I could see the war being waged within her, the battle between pride and something deeper, something that might have been love buried beneath years of bitterness and loss. "Margaret was a fool," she said at last, and her voice cracked on the words. "She threw away everything for a man who was not worth the canvas he painted on. I tried to save her from herself, tried to make her see reason, but she would not listen, and in the end, she chose death over duty." "She loved him," I said quietly. "She loved him enough to die for that love. I do not ask you to approve of her choices, but surely you can understand the power of such devotion." The dowager's composure finally broke. Tears spilled down her weathered cheeks, carving channels through the powder she wore. She looked suddenly old, suddenly fragile, a woman who had lost her daughter and buried her grief beneath layers of cruelty and control. "I never wanted her to die," she whispered. "I only wanted her to come back to me, to be the daughter I had raised." I thought if I removed the painter, if I eliminated the distraction, she would remember who she was. I did not know she would choose to follow him into the grave. Her words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with regret and old grief. I watched this woman who had tormented me for 3 years, who had made my life a constant exercise in humiliation, and I felt something unexpected stir within me. Not forgiveness, not quite, but understanding. She was a mother who had lost her child, who had tried to control what could not be controlled, and had paid the ultimate price. Sebastian crossed the room and took his mother's hands in his own. It was the first gesture of tenderness I had ever seen pass between them, the first crack in the wall of formality that had always separated them. "We cannot change the past," he said gently. "We cannot bring Margaret back, cannot undo the choices that were made, but we can give her daughter a future. We can honor Margaret's memory by loving the child she left behind." The dowager looked at Rose, really looked at her for the first time, and I saw recognition dawn in her eyes, the shape of the face, the curve of the lips, the way the baby's eyes crinkled when she smiled. Margaret, reflected in the features of her child. I saw the dowager's composure crumble completely then, saw tears fall freely down her face as she confronted the living reminder of everything she had lost. "She has her mother's smile," the dowager said, her voice barely audible. "And her eyes, those are Margaret's eyes." I stepped closer, bringing Rose within reach, and after a moment's hesitation, the dowager extended one trembling hand to touch the baby's cheek. Rose grasped her finger with the innocent trust of a child who knew nothing of the complicated history that surrounded her. "I will keep your secret," the dowager said finally. "Not for you, Sebastian, and not for your wife, but for Margaret, for the daughter I failed. It was not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but it was a beginning." The dowager stayed for tea, her manner still stiff and formal, but the sharp edges had been blunted. She held Rose for a few moments before she left, and I saw something soften in her face that I had never thought possible. After she had gone, Sebastian found me in the nursery, where I had retreated to process everything that had happened. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching me rock Rose in the chair by the window, and then he crossed the room and knelt beside me. "Thank you," he said simply. I looked down at him, this man I had married without love and lived beside without hope. He seemed different now, the coldness that had defined him melting away to reveal something warmer beneath. "I did not do it for thanks," I replied. "I did it for her. And for you." He reached up and touched my face, his fingers gentle against my cheek. It was such a small gesture, so intimate and unexpected, that I felt tears spring to my eyes. "I have wasted so much time," he said quietly. "So many years keeping you at a distance, believing that if I did not let myself care for you, I could not be hurt again. But you have shown me something I had forgotten, Eleanor. You have shown me that love is not weakness. It is strength." "Sebastian," I began, but he shook his head. "Let me say this," he continued. "When I married you, I thought of it only as a transaction, a duty to be fulfilled. I told myself that I could not love you, would not love you, because love had brought me nothing but pain. But watching you with Rose, seeing the way you have fought for her, sacrificed for her, I find that I cannot maintain the walls I built." He took my hand and pressed his lips to my palm, a gesture so tender it made my heart ache. "I love you, Eleanor," he said. "I do not know when it began, only that I can no longer deny it. You have brought light into this house of shadows, and I do not deserve you, but I am asking you to let me try. Let me be the husband I should have been from the beginning." I could not speak. The words I had longed to hear for 3 years, the love I had given up hope of ever receiving, offered freely in the quiet of the nursery while Rose slept peacefully in my arms. It seemed impossible, a dream from which I would surely wake. But his hand was warm in mine, his eyes earnest and vulnerable, and I knew that this was real. This was the redemption I had never dared to imagine. "I love you too," I whispered. "I think I have loved you since the night I found Rose, since I saw who you truly are beneath the armor you wear. I love your devotion to your sister, your courage in protecting her child, your willingness to trust me with your darkest secrets. I love all of you, Sebastian, even the parts you tried to hide." He rose and pulled me gently to my feet, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. And then, for the first time in our marriage, he kissed me. Not the perfunctory gesture of duty we had shared on our wedding night, but a real kiss, deep and tender and full of promise. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I had known in my marriage. Sebastian no longer retreated to his study after dinner, but stayed with me in the drawing room, reading by the fire while I worked on my embroidery. He joined me for breakfast each morning, asking about my plans for the day, showing interest in my thoughts and opinions. He visited the nursery not just to see Rose, but to spend time with both of us together, the 3 of us forming a family that I had never dared to imagine. We began to take walks together in the afternoons, bundled against the winter cold, wandering the frost-covered gardens, while servants followed at a discreet distance, with Rose wrapped warmly in her pram. Sebastian told me about his childhood, about the father he had lost too young and the mother who had grown hard in her grief. He spoke of his dreams for Thornfield, his hopes for the future, his fears that he would fail the legacy entrusted to him. And I, in turn, shared pieces of myself I had kept hidden for so long. I told him about my own childhood, about the father who had gambled away our fortune and the mother who had taught me to survive through silence and compliance. I spoke of the girl I had been before our marriage, full of hopes and dreams that had slowly withered in the face of reality. I told him everything, and he listened with a patience and attention I had never experienced from anyone. One evening, as we sat together in the library watching the snow fall outside the windows, Sebastian took my hand and pressed something into my palm. I looked down and found a small velvet box worn with age. "It belonged to my grandmother," he said quietly. "I should have given it to you on our wedding day, but I was too much of a coward. I want you to have it now." Inside the box was a ring, a delicate band of gold set with a single sapphire that caught the firelight and scattered it into 1,000 blue fragments. I slipped it onto my finger, where it fit as though it had been made for me. "A proper wedding," Sebastian said, watching my face with anxious eyes. "That is what you deserve. A proper wedding, with flowers and music and guests who have come to celebrate rather than merely to witness. I know we cannot undo the past, but perhaps we can begin again." The servants noticed the change immediately. Mrs. Blackwood smiled more often, and I caught her wiping tears from her eyes one afternoon when she came upon Sebastian and me walking in the garden with Rose bundled between us. The footmen stood straighter, the maids hummed as they worked. It was as though the entire house had been holding its breath for years, and now, finally, it could exhale. Christmas came, and with it a transformation of Thornfield that I would never have thought possible. Sebastian ordered holly and ivy to be hung in every room, candles to be placed in every window. A great tree was brought into the entrance hall and decorated with ribbons and glass ornaments that had belonged to generations of Hales. For the first time since my arrival, the house felt alive with joy rather than merely existing in cold formality. On Christmas morning, I woke to find Sebastian already awake, watching me with an expression of such tenderness that my breath caught in my throat. "Happy Christmas, Eleanor," he said, and kissed me softly on the forehead. We spent the day together as a family, the three of us cocooned in warmth while the winter raged outside. Rose received her first Christmas gifts, soft toys and picture books that she was far too young to appreciate, but that delighted her nonetheless. The dowager even visited, her manner still reserved, but lacking the sharp cruelty that had once defined her. She held Rose for nearly an hour, singing old lullabies in a voice rusty from disuse, and when she left, she kissed my cheek with something that might have been affection. I allowed myself to believe that we had won, that the worst was behind us, and only happiness lay ahead. I should have known better than to trust such fragile dreams. But happiness, I was learning, was a fragile thing. And on a bitter December evening, just 3 days after Christmas, a letter arrived that threatened to shatter everything we had built. It came from London, from a solicitor whose name I did not recognize. Sebastian read it in his study, and when he emerged, his face was ashen. "What is it?" I asked, fear clutching at my heart. He handed me the letter without a word. I read it quickly, the words blurring before my eyes as their meaning sank in. A man claiming to be Rose's father had emerged from the shadows. The painter, it seemed, had not died after all, and he had come to claim his daughter. The letter trembled in my hands as I read it a second time, then a third, as though repetition might somehow change the words printed upon the page. A man named Thomas Whitmore claimed to be the painter who had loved Margaret, the father of her child. He had been living in Italy for the past year, he wrote, having fled England after a violent altercation that had nearly cost him his life. He had only recently learned of Margaret's death and of the existence of their daughter. He demanded to see the child. He demanded his rights as her father. "This cannot be," I said, looking up at Sebastian with desperate eyes. "You told me he was dead." Everyone believed he was dead. Sebastian's jaw was tight with tension, his hands clenched at his sides. "I saw the body myself," he said. "I identified him at the morgue. It was Thomas Whitmore, I was certain of it." Then who is this man? And how does he know about Rose? We stood in silence, the weight of the question pressing down upon us. If this man was truly Thomas Whitmore, then he had a legal claim to his daughter that no amount of wealth or influence could overcome. An illegitimate child belonged to no one, but a father who acknowledged his offspring could take them wherever he wished. We could lose Rose. After everything we had done to protect her, we could lose her to a stranger. "I will not let this happen," I said, and my voice was steady despite the terror clawing at my heart. "We will fight him, Sebastian. We will prove that he is a fraud or a fortune hunter or whatever he may be. Rose is ours, and no one will take her from us." Sebastian looked at me with something like awe in his eyes. He crossed the room and took me in his arms, holding me tightly against his chest. "How did I ever think you were cold?" he murmured into my hair. "You are the fiercest woman I have ever known, Eleanor, and I thank God every day that you are mine." We sent word to London immediately, engaging the finest solicitors and investigators that money could procure. Within a week, we had learned everything there was to know about Thomas Whitmore, or rather, about the man who claimed to bear that name. His real name was Edward Crane, a petty criminal with a history of fraud and deception. He had learned of Rose's existence through a former servant of the Thornfield estate, a footman who had been dismissed for theft and who had harbored a grudge against the family ever since. Crane had seen an opportunity for blackmail, for extortion, for whatever wealth he could extract from a desperate duke willing to pay any price to protect his secrets. The relief I felt upon learning the truth was almost overwhelming. I wept in Sebastian's arms, great heaving sobs that released all the fear and tension I had been holding inside. Rose was safe. Our family was safe. The threat had been nothing but smoke and mirrors, the desperate scheme of greedy men. But Sebastian was not content to let the matter rest. He traveled to London himself to confront Edward Crane, accompanied by our solicitor and 2 constables. I do not know what words passed between them, what threats were made, or what promises extracted. When Sebastian returned 3 days later, he told me only that Crane had been arrested for fraud and that we would never hear from him again. "And the footman?" I asked. "The one who betrayed us?" Sebastian's expression darkened. "He has been dealt with," he said. "He will not trouble any family again." I did not ask for details. There are some things a wife is better off not knowing, and I trusted Sebastian to protect our family by whatever means necessary. The cold, distant duke I had married was gone, replaced by a man who would move heaven and earth for those he loved. I could not ask for more than that. The new year arrived with a fresh blanket of snow and a sense of possibility I had never felt before. Sebastian and I renewed our wedding vows in a private ceremony in the chapel at Thornfield, with only Mrs. Blackwood and Agnes as witnesses. It was not the grand affair he had promised, but it was perfect in its intimacy, in the sincerity of the words we spoke to each other. The chapel was small and ancient, its stone walls softened by centuries of prayer and candlelight. Winter sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting pools of color across the worn floor. I wore a gown of ivory silk, simpler than my original wedding dress, but infinitely more precious to me. Sebastian stood at the altar in a coat of deep blue, and when I walked toward him, I saw tears glistening in his eyes. The vicar who officiated was old and kind, a man who had christened Sebastian as an infant, and who understood without being told that this ceremony meant more than any words could express. He spoke the traditional prayers with a tenderness that touched my heart, blessing our union with a sincerity that our first wedding had lacked. "I take you, Eleanor, to be my wife," Sebastian said, holding my hands in his own. His voice was steady but thick with emotion, not out of duty or obligation, but out of love. "I promise to honor you, to cherish you, to stand beside you in all things. I promise to be the husband you deserve, today and every day for the rest of our lives." "And I take you, Sebastian," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. Not as a stranger or a savior, but as my partner, my equal, my heart. I promise to love you through darkness and light, through joy and sorrow, through all the years that lie ahead. We sealed our vows with a kiss that held all the promise of a future neither of us had dared to imagine. And when we emerged from the chapel into the winter sunlight, I felt as though I had been reborn into a new life, a life of love and purpose and belonging. The months that followed were the happiest I had ever known. Spring came to Thornfield, painting the gardens in shades of green and gold. Rose grew stronger with each passing day, learning to sit up on her own, to reach for the toys we dangled before her, to laugh at the faces Sebastian made to amuse her. She called me Mama for the first time on a warm afternoon in April, the word tumbling from her lips as though it were the most natural thing in the world. I held her close and wept with joy, feeling in that moment that all the pain of my past had been worth enduring to arrive at this single, perfect instant. The dowager visited more frequently now, her manner softening with each encounter. She brought gifts for Rose, elaborate dresses and delicate bonnets that were far too fine for a child who spent most of her time crawling on the nursery floor. But I accepted them graciously, understanding that this was her way of making amends, of trying to be the grandmother she had never allowed herself to be. One afternoon, as we sat together in the garden watching Rose play on a blanket spread beneath the oak trees, the dowager spoke words I had never expected to hear. "I was wrong about you, Eleanor," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "When Sebastian married you, I thought you were nothing but a burden, a disappointing necessity. I treated you cruelly, and I am sorry for it." I looked at her in surprise. In 3 years of marriage, she had never once apologized for anything. "You have proven yourself to be exactly what this family needed," she continued. "You have brought my son back to life, given Margaret's daughter a mother's love, and taught an old woman that it is never too late to change. I do not ask for your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I am grateful." I reached out and took her hand, feeling the thin bones beneath the papery skin. "I forgive you," I said simply. "We have all made mistakes. What matters is that we choose to be better." She squeezed my hand, and something passed between us that I can only describe as peace. We were not friends, perhaps would never be friends, but we were family. And family, I was learning, was not about blood or birth or the circumstances that brought people together. It was about choice, about love, about the willingness to keep trying even when the path was difficult. Summer arrived in a blaze of sunshine and warmth, and with it came news that changed everything once more. I had been feeling unwell for several weeks, tired and nauseous in a way that seemed to have no explanation. The scent of certain foods turned my stomach, and I found myself weeping at the smallest provocations, overcome by emotions I could not control. When I finally summoned the doctor, I expected him to prescribe rest and perhaps some tonic for my nerves. Instead, he delivered news that left me speechless with wonder. "You are with child, my lady," he said, his face beaming with professional satisfaction. "Approximately 2 months along, by my estimation. Congratulations." I sat in stunned silence long after he had gone, my hand pressed against my stomach as though I could feel the tiny life growing within. For 3 years I had been told I was barren, had believed myself incapable of bearing children. The doctors had examined me. The society matrons had whispered their judgments, and I had accepted their verdict as unassailable truth. But they had been wrong. All of them wrong. I thought of all the tears I had shed, all the shame I had carried, all the nights I had lain awake believing myself broken and worthless. I thought of the cruel words that had been spoken about me, the pitying glances, the whispered condemnations, and I laughed, a sound that bordered on hysteria, releasing all the pain and fear and self-doubt that had accumulated over years of suffering. When Sebastian came home that evening, I met him in the entrance hall, unable to wait another moment to share the news. He saw my face and immediately assumed the worst, crossing to me with concern etched in every line of his features. "What is it?" he asked. "What has happened?" I took his hands and placed them on my stomach, looking up into his eyes with all the love and joy I felt bursting within me. "We are going to have a baby," I said. The expression that crossed his face was one I will carry with me until the day I die. Shock, disbelief, hope, and finally, overwhelming joy. He lifted me off my feet and spun me around, laughing with an abandon I had never seen in him before. "A baby," he repeated, setting me down gently and cradling my face in his hands. "Our baby. Eleanor, this is a miracle." "I know," I whispered. "I know." The pregnancy was easier than I had feared, though I spent much of it resting at the doctor's insistence. Sebastian hovered over me like a protective guardian, refusing to let me climb stairs or carry anything heavier than a teacup. Rose seemed to sense the change as well, becoming gentler in my presence, content to sit beside me on the sofa and look at picture books while I read the words aloud. Our son was born on a cold February morning, entering the world with a lusty cry that echoed through the halls of Thornfield. Sebastian was at my side throughout the labor, holding my hand and murmuring encouragement, refusing to leave despite the midwife's scandalized protests. When the baby was finally placed in my arms, I looked down at his red, wrinkled face and felt my heart expand to accommodate yet another infinite love. We named him William, after Sebastian's father, and from the moment he opened his eyes, he was the light of our lives. Rose adored her baby brother with a fierce protectiveness that reminded me of myself. She would stand guard over his cradle, patting his blanket with gentle hands, and declare to anyone who would listen that he was her William and no one was allowed to take him away. The years that followed were kind to us. Sebastian proved to be the husband and father I had never dared to dream of, devoted to his family in a way that transformed him entirely. The coldness that had once defined him melted away completely, replaced by warmth and tenderness and a capacity for joy that seemed to grow with each passing day. The dowager lived long enough to see William take his first steps, to hear him call her grandmother with the innocent affection of childhood. She died peacefully in her sleep one autumn evening, and though I wept at her passing, I wept also with gratitude for the reconciliation we had achieved. Rose grew into a beautiful young woman, with Margaret's golden hair and her father's artistic spirit. We told her the truth of her origins when she was old enough to understand, and she received the knowledge with grace and maturity beyond her years. She was a Hale in every way that mattered, beloved daughter of a duke and duchess, cherished sister to William and to the 2 more children who followed him. And I, Eleanor, the woman they had called Barren, became the mother of 4. The whispers that had once followed me through ballrooms faded into silence, replaced by admiration for the family I had built, the love I had nurtured, the legacy I would leave behind. Sometimes I wondered what those society women would say if they could see me now, surrounded by children and grandchildren, presiding over a house filled with laughter and love. I wondered if they remembered the cruel things they had said, the judgment they had passed so carelessly on a young woman whose only crime was a body that refused to perform on their schedule. But mostly, I did not think of them at all. They had ceased to matter long ago, their opinions rendered meaningless by the life I had created in spite of them. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the house was still, I would sometimes stand at the window of my chamber and look out over the moonlit gardens of Thornfield. The roses would be blooming in summer, their perfume drifting up to my window, and I would think of the child for whom they were named. I would think of Margaret, the sister Sebastian had loved and lost, and I would send a silent prayer of gratitude to her spirit. She had given us Rose, and Rose had given us everything else. I would think of the frightened young bride who had arrived here so many years ago, believing herself destined for a life of emptiness and disappointment. And I would marvel at the journey that had brought me from that dark place to this one, from loneliness to love, from despair to hope. I would remember the stormy night when everything changed, when I had followed the sound of a baby crying into the darkness and emerged into the light. They had mocked me for being barren, had dismissed me as worthless and broken. But I had found a baby in a locked room, a child who needed a mother as desperately as I needed a child to love. And in saving her, I had saved myself, had opened the door to a life more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. The world had told me I was nothing, but I had proven them wrong. I was Eleanor Hale, Duchess of Thornfield, wife and mother, keeper of secrets and guardian of love. And I was, at last, exactly who I was always meant to be.